Leviathans, gods and monsters in the sea and state tonight. So this is gods, monsters, and politics. But as usual, we're going to take a different angle than what you might expect, and you might be relieved about that. You might be looking for a different angle on politics these days. So, again, here's where we've been. We looked at how to make a god. We looked at how to make a monster. We looked at the theogony and the Nume Elish for giving birth to gods and monsters. And then the divine and monstrous feminine, Christian gods and monsters with the book of Revelation. So, let's get to it. That's where we've been. This is where we are now. So, Leviathan is a term that comes from the Hebrew Bible. We've talked about it briefly in other lectures, and here are the biblical texts where it's found. So let me just read those to you so you get the sense of Leviathan as it's portrayed in the Hebrew Bible. Now, there are other references. For example, the great whale that swallows Jonah uses the same Hebrew word. So, you know, there's this sense of a monster in the sea and a monster on the land. All right, the monster on the land is probably a hippo or maybe a crocodile. But this is the monster in the sea. Job 41:1, and this is the most important. Sorry, that's so small. I'll read it out to you. This is the most important reference to Leviathan. And let me set it up a little bit for you. In the book of Job, you have Job, who is a servant of God, who's tested as the result of a bet that this Satan figure places with God. And so God allows Satan to wipe everything out in Job's life, his wealth, but also his family. And Job spends most of the book arguing with his three friends about justice. He didn't do anything wrong. He clearly did nothing wrong, but all this happened to him. So, of course, the three friends come along and say, well, you must have done something. And they have three different versions of what Job could have, should have, maybe did do in their minds. But Job maintains his innocence and cries out to God and says, I need a referee, I need an umpire, I need somebody to call this situation because these guys are wrong. Well, finally that happens. Someone comes down to be a referee for Job, and it's the whirlwind, and this voice speaks from the whirlwind. And basically the message is not comforting at all. The message is, hey, were you there at creation? Do you know what creators know? And of course, Job has no response because he wasn't there at creation. He doesn't know what creators know. And then in part of this rhetorical diatribe God, or the whirlwind, gives to Job, God says, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down its tongue with a cord? So Leviathan is this creation of God, but something that is so powerful that it overwhelms the human creation. Psalm 74:4, you crushed the heads of Leviathan, God, addressed to God. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. Okay? So Leviathan now is food. It's something that can be hunted. Psalm 104, there go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport in it. So you get this sense here that the Leviathan is something to be proud of. It's part of God's creation to be proud of because it's so powerful. Dangerous, to be sure, but also powerful. It shifts some with the prophetic texts like Isaiah. On that day, the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. That's different. Remember last time, with the book of Revelation, we saw how the author of the book of Revelation connected the serpent in the garden to Leviathan, to the dragon in his vision. So this is Leviathan as evil, or something that needs, as the dragon, the old dragon. Esdras, then you kept in existence two living creatures, the one you call Behemoth, that's the hippo or whatever, and the name of the other Leviathan. But to Leviathan you gave the seventh part, the watery part, and you have kept them to be eaten by whom you wish and when you wish. And of course there's the Jewish festival of Sukkot, the festival of booths, which concludes with a prayer recited upon leaving the sukkah or the booth. This: may it be your will, Lord our God and God of our forefathers, that just as I have fulfilled and dwelt in this sukkah, so may I merit in the coming year to dwell in the sukkah of the skin of Leviathan next year in Jerusalem. The skin of Leviathan. So you've got this double meaning attached to this creature, where it's something to be proud of. It's an emblematic of God's creation and its power and wonder, and yet it's very easily just turned to something evil, to something that we will use for our own religious purposes. And that continues in the Talmud and the Mishnah. These are the commentaries upon the Hebrew Bible by the rabbis. By the way, if you don't know this, this is just a wonderful approach to biblical texts that is foreign to many Christians, which is midrash, which is you take the text and you argue about it in the text. And so in the Talmud and the Mishnah, you might have, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then the rabbis writing around that verse and arguing with each other right on the page, right? It's an understanding of a sacred text that involves and embeds dialogue, as opposed to a text that is frozen and unchanging. Very interesting in the Jewish tradition. God in the Talmud and the Mishnah originally produced a male and female Leviathan, but he slew the female. Sorry, there it is again. He slew the female, reserving her flesh for the banquet that would be given to the righteous on the advent of the Messiah. And we saw where the skin will be used as a tent. Interesting, very symbolic, right? The conquering of the unknown, the dragon, the mystery in the sea. We will bring it on land and we will use it for our own purposes. Leviathan is the classic monster, because remember in lecture 2, discussion 2, we talked about the etymology of monster, which means to demonstrate, monstrum, to reveal. And the Leviathan is there to make a point. And in fact, it's there to make several points. That God is more powerful. God created Leviathan. And Leviathan is also always there. So before you get too haughty and go out in your ship and think you've conquered the unknown, the depths of the ocean, right? And we remember what that means from our old myths. It's Tiamat, for example, the original goddess. Just, don't be too cocky about it, because Leviathan's always there. Leviathan's always there. Chaos is always there, always on the edge of your ordered life, right? Just beneath the surface, literally. All right. So I said we're going to talk about God's monsters in politics. I didn't start this conversation. Thomas Hobbes did in 1651 with his work on government, Leviathan. Why would you call a treatise on government Leviathan? Well, we're going to see. That's the first part of our discussion tonight. Let's situate Thomas Hobbes right now. So he lived 1588 to 1679. He wrote Leviathan in 1651. Only 3 years before that had been the end of the English civil wars, really, more than one. You may remember this from your history. This is Oliver Cromwell and King Charles I, and does not end well for Charles. You may remember he loses his head. Literally, it's the effort to create a parliament, and successful eventually effort to do that. That's in the UK, that's in England, sorry. Europe had its own religious wars. This was the Protestant religious wars that raged throughout, especially France, all over Europe, really. So Hobbes is experiencing chaos, but it's in the form of religion now. Religion is the chaos, established religion. The Protestant and Catholic churches, also the split. That split in England was part of that too. And what he's coming out of, for the choices for Hobbes are the divine right of kings, which was the state doctrine to that point, or these crazy religious wars between Protestants and Catholics. So, what do you do? Well, Hobbes created what is now known as the social contract theory. You may have heard of this, but it's not what you might think. For all social contract theorists, for all theorists of government really, you have to imagine life before government. They call this the state of nature. All right, so what is the state of nature without civilization? But when we talk about civilization here, we really mean government. We mean a body of laws and rulers and enforcers of those laws. Hobbes has a famous phrase where he describes the state of nature as, where he says, life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hey, cool. You can go right from there to the first noble truth of the Buddha. Life is suffering. So the state of nature for Hobbes is a state of war, and he sees it, and he's been seeing it his whole life, is that given without some sort of authority, and we don't want it to be the divine right of a king, without some sort of authority, we will devolve into this state of nature, meaning that's who we are. We are people who live lives that are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. What's called for, Hobbes thinks, is a new Genesis. And that's what he creates here. He he recreates the world here through government. He says what we need is a new artificial life, as he puts it, with man, by which he actually meant man, not men and women, as the creator and the sustainer. So, given our history here, what we've studied in this course, Gods and Monsters, we've seen these myths emerge out of chaos and barely containing chaos. And you have a god monster or a godster that keeps chaos at bay while also bringing chaos sometimes. And sometimes the chaos monsters get put in the pit, but they're always ready to get out. They'll come out anytime, right? So you don't just obliterate the monsters, you keep them in the pit because, they're always there. The monster never leaves. Remember one of our laws of monsters. So he's basically doing a new creation myth. Now Hobbes, it's debated whether or not he was an atheist. He is certainly a modern man. This is 1651. This is the birth of modernism. Descartes does his meditation, writes his meditation 1601. Sir Isaac Newton, 1630 something, Francis Bacon. This is a new order, intellectual order and social order emerging after, remember, the Dark Ages and then the Reformation and the Renaissance. So new things are happening. And Thomas Hobbes is right in the middle of it, this Englishman who is trying actually to use geometry to make his argument. Because if you remember geometry, you have the axioms, and then I barely remember. You have the theorems and the axioms, and then the conclusions. Anyway, the point is he wants to make philosophy, he wants to make political philosophy mathematic. So does Descartes. Descartes' a mathematician. Bacon's a scientist. See, that's the new order. That's the new way of knowing, is this method. Now, it's not the scientific method yet, but it's the beginnings of the scientific method, where we're no longer going to just say, well, whatever we don't know, God did. No, those days are gone in modernism. This is called modernism. Because we can replace that with man and our methods. All right? So he says, yeah, we need an artificial man. So he's creating a new creation myth. He's generating a new creation myth. Who is this artificial man? Well, the artificial man is the sovereign of the state. So you don't want to be in the state of nature, because that's nasty, brutish, and short. You want to be in the state of government, of control, of power. So you need an artificial man. You need something generated, an idea that becomes embodied to create the state. That's what you need. And he keeps the metaphor going. So of this artificial man, this sovereignty, power, authority is this man's soul. The magistrates are his joints. Reward and punishment are his nervous system. Wealth is his strength. Safety is his business. His counselors are memory. His laws are reason. This is, let us make man all over again. So analogy was very important to the type of thinking that was being done then. So he has to carry that analogy all the way through, right to the nerves and to the joints. All right, so this man, this artificial man, the state, what does that mean for me? Well, he says it's a mortal God, so it means you obey this God. See, echoes here of the theogony, the creation of gods and monsters. He says that as a citizen of the state, you authorize and give up your right of governing yourself to this man, to this sovereign. The multitude become one person or one common wealth. For by this authority, the sovereign hath the use of so much power and strength conferred on him that by terror thereof he is enabled to conform the wills of them all to peace at home and mutual aid against their enemies abroad. The mortal God. This God's body is made of us. We are individuals. That's us, there in the image. This is the frontispiece to the Leviathan, is us made up of the body of this sovereign. And then the original image had faces there, but the later image, the one that gets used with the publication, You can't see any faces. We are turned inward, right? So we have no agency. We quite literally give up our agency, our power, to this sovereign who oversees all, but we cannot see him. Sound good? This is an advancement, remember, over the divine right of kings, where you just say, hey, it's the king and he slept with her and they had a child, so it must be God's will. This is the advancement. But why Leviathan? Why call this thing Leviathan? That was very deliberate. Thomas Hobbes was a brilliant man, and he did this with great forethought. So remember Job 41, our instance of Leviathan. 41:24 says, there is nothing on earth to be compared with him. And this is the full citation, quotation from Hobbes. He calleth him the king of the proud. God calls Leviathan the king of the proud. There is nothing, saith he, on earth to be compared with him. He's awesome in power and terror. He is made so as not to be afraid. He seeth every high thing below him and is king of all the children of pride. But because he is mortal and subject to decay as all other earthly creatures are, and because there is that in heaven, though not on earth, that he should stand in fear of and whose laws he ought to obey, I shall in the next following chapters speak of his diseases and the causes of his mortality and of what laws of nature he is bound to obey. So this is a godster. This is a godlike monster, a monster-like deity who by definition must be more powerful than us, though Hobbes is not going to put him as powerful as God. Well, what creature is that? It's Leviathan. It's the perfect representation of Leviathan. So he's on earth, like us. We are on earth. He's not in heaven. Because if you say heaven, we're going to get our orders from heaven, then there's going to be some king come along and say, oh, well, God ordained me to rule over you, just as this has been for millennia. No, you can't have that. You've got to have a mortal man, a mortal Leviathan. So God's answer to Job, do you know what creators know? Were you there when I created Leviathan? Are you as powerful as Leviathan? That's Hobbes' answer to us. That's the state's answer to us. Do you have the power that I do? No, then you have nothing more to say. It is a brutal, a powerful silencing by pure force. It is trans-ethical. There's no good or bad here. The Leviathan's not good. The Leviathan is powerful. There is no justice here. This is not a body politic that's designed to achieve justice. It's designed to prevent the state of nature. Period. So maybe if you want to count that as justice, that we're not killing each other, then you can. But this is not the Enlightenment sense of justice. In fact, the goal is peace without justice. We are the monstrous. We are. Therefore, we need a master monster. We need Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes, man. I want to party with that guy. Let's look at some other ideas of the state of nature. Hobbes is hard because we're looking back through democracy at Hobbes, which was not even an option. That would be like, what? What are you talking about, democracy? Let the people rule themselves? That would be a mess, and he might have been right. in 2017, but it's hard for us to not see democracy as one possibility. It was not a possibility, right? So, John Locke's an interesting cat. Oh, sorry. Somewhat, there he is. Somewhat, living at the same time as Hobbes. All these people have these notions of the state of nature, which is foundational to social contract theory, which is what we're talking about. What kind of contract do we make with each other to keep us from killing each other? Or just think about it, we're in LA, think about it in traffic. What makes traffic work? I think traffic is fascinating. Why does it work? I mean, it doesn't work perfectly, but, but it does. It does. All right, bad example. Got to know my audience a little bit and my place. All right, so the state of nature is not good. With Hobbes and Locke. But Locke's a little more positive. He says that the state of nature is pre-political, but it's not pre-moral. There are morals in the state of nature. Some of you may have read C.S. Lewis, who makes a big deal out of this, that they're natural morals, law of nature, which for Locke means that we don't act alone, we act in groups. In fact, he talks about mothers and their children. Well, the law of nature also says that you'll give up your life for your child. Or maybe you'll give up your life for other people. This is a later philosopher named Schopenhauer who talks about the will to be and how we recognize life and we'll give up ours in exchange for it sometimes. Well, that's not the state of nature that Hobbes is seeing. And here's the key for Locke is private property. Private property is the space where you protect you and your family. Not only do you protect you and your family, you generate food and shelter for your family. You must have private property. And that's the beginning of what you know as the private property ideology, which is if you have it, which will come to mean, if you have it, you're a person. If you don't, maybe you're 3/5 of the person, right? Locke is interesting in that he annoys me in that he uses this private property notion to justify the colonization of the Americas. Because, you see, the indigenous people here did not use their property appropriately. So it wasn't really theirs. How convenient. So Locke says, we will endure a loss of liberty. And this is at the heart of every, and kind of what you were saying, this is at the heart of every social contract theorist is what will we give up for security? You know, we're still having that argument today. What will we give up for security? Locke says we will give up our freedom in exchange for laws, judges, and enforcement of those laws. That's right, isn't it? We do that, right? Yeah. The sovereign, far from being this Leviathan for Locke, must recognize this sacrifice. Okay, now we're getting a little closer to the democratic ideal, right? And in fact, Thomas Jefferson will be influenced quite a bit by Locke's argument here. Now, notice we're coming along here a little bit in time. So now it's 1712, 1778. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. What is his state of nature? Just the opposite. So you've got Hobbes with the state of nature as nasty, brutish, and short. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You've got Locke as a kind of conjugal. We aren't individuals running around. We do form groups to help raise children and to survive, etc. Now we've got Rousseau, who is just romanticized the whole thing. The state of nature is perfect. It is ideal. And in fact, unlike Locke, who says that Native Americans deserve to have their land, their property seized because they weren't using it as they should, Rousseau says, no, the noble savages, they were our best selves. That's who we should be, if we could be. We should be indigenous people. He does use the phrase noble savage, which has its own problems, shall we say, as anything does when you romanticize it. There's a noble savage. It has to be, by nature, small groups of people with lots of land, right, in order to forage and hunt, whatever. When changes come, such as more population, new technology, more leisure time, this noble, peaceful, Edenic, should we say, state of nature disappears. It just disappears. It can't hold up under those changes. And that's in fact true, that indigenous cultures were extremely vulnerable to colonization for all kinds of reasons, other reasons than Rousseau mentions, such as disease. He considers the acquisition of private property the fall from grace from this noble state of nature. When you start dividing up land and saying, this is mine, that is not yours, and marking things off, that is a fall. That is a devolution, not an evolution. And he says that the state then comes along to maintain this inequality based on property rights. You're liking this, Margot, right? Resist the man. His famous phrase, man was born free and he is everywhere in chains. So he also thought that the social contract should be direct democracy. And just in case you don't know this, we do not live in a democracy here. We live in a republic, meaning we vote for people to represent us. We don't represent ourselves. There was a wonderfully crazy man back in the 90s named Ross Perot who said we should do this. We should have direct democracy. So if you think the California ballot initiatives are complex, imagine making every law through direct democracy. You have to vote on every single piece of legislation. That's Rousseau's idea. That would be crazy and fun. And then there's John Rawls, whom you may have heard of, a Kantian, simply meaning that we have the ability to make ethical judgments from a universal perspective. So you may remember from college Kant's categorical imperative, his ethical philosophy. The categorical imperative is, do nothing that you could not wish that thing to be a universal law. All right, so I want to kill the guy who cut me off on the 101. If that were a universal law, Los Angeles would be empty in a week. I therefore cannot choose that action ethically. I cannot will it to become a universal law. So Rawls is coming out of this tradition, and he says that we should set up the state, we should make this social contract, right, based on a veil of ignorance. In other words, we should not know how our particular station, a person of our ethnicity or social class or gender, I don't think he said gender, I wish it said gender, should fare in this new society. In other words, you try to eliminate self-interest. That's right, try to eliminate self-interest. I know that sounds strange these days. So his state of nature is abstract, it's hypothetical. I don't know who I am as I create this social contract. I don't know if I'm a man, a woman, poor man, wealthy man, savage, or whatever. I don't know. I just don't know. So now create a social contract. Because justice is fairness, bottom line. Fair is fair. So the two principles here that must be followed in order for Rawls. As much liberty as possible, as long as it's all equal. So resist restraining freedom. But if you restrain it, you must restrain it equally. Makes sense, right? He recognized that there will be inequalities in society, but he said that inequalities must benefit the whole. So sure, there can be inequalities. Some people might have more than others. But in their process, and again, this is the second principle, it comes only after the first. A rising tide really does have to lift all the boats, right? So you can't have a state-sanctioned inequality that does not at least provide some benefit to everyone. Now, frankly, the politicians of the Great Society, Kennedy and Johnson, and frankly, a lot of other people from the other party even, have been Rawlsians following these principles, which is difficult to follow. Carol Pateman here at UCLA actually says, you know what's missing in these social contracts? Women. And I think she has a really good point. Hobbes is certainly talking about a mortal, 2 L's, man. He's talking about the sovereign as a man. He's pretty clear about it. But in these other hypothetical, idealized states of nature and states and social contracts, the default setting is, as usual, male. Okay? So, for example, she's like, this is great stuff, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Rawls. Good for you. This is amazing. Where are the women? And she says every social contract is an agreement, is a tacit agreement by men to control and dominate women. It's hard to say she's wrong because none of that ever changed with these social contracts. Women weren't even allowed to vote until 1921. 21? We're not even allowed to vote. So she says modernism's a new kind of patriarchy. So these wonderful modernist inventions, this new method, this modernist method is great. It's better than the old method, but it's also thoroughly patriarchal, meaning that it does nothing to change the status of women in the state. And I think that's right. I'm not going to talk about Freud and the primal horde unless you really want me to. But, yeah, okay, all right. So this is from Totem and Taboo, his book Totem and Taboo. And his notion was that in what he would call primitive societies, that there was a powerful male who basically had sex with all the females. All right? And so a horde of males got together and overpowered the male so that they could have women too. This is Freud. This is Freud. And so they felt guilty because guilt is what drives most things in Freud. And so they made the original father figure a god. The father in the sky. We feel bad that we killed you, but we really wanted to have sex, but we'll worship you from now on. So that's Freud and the primal horde that Pateman kind of refers to some in her work. But what I think is more important is the marriage, prostitution, motherhood contract. She says that the social contract is, in fact, for women, a marriage, prostitution, motherhood contract, by which she means that marriage is the only state, the only way of being for a woman where she is seen as legitimate in this new contract. That particular marriage contract, she draws upon Frederick Engels, Marx's companion, and not companion, Marx's co-author in some of his works, who wrote a treatise about marriage as legalized prostitution. And so, it's still in many states today, a husband cannot be convicted or charged with rape. Why? Because of his wife, because that's part of the contract, sexual access, right? And then motherhood. Motherhood must occur within these constraints dictated by the state. All right. So what does this all mean? A lot, I think. Nature. That is Putin. Leviathan. Good. Right. The good eye. What is nature? I mean, we never, in all this social contract theory, that was assumed. But nature, if you ask any philosopher, is a very difficult term to define. What does it mean? What does nature mean? Well, it means unspoiled, pure, purely natural, not cultural. Really? What's that look like? Just go to the opening of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is like the great parable of humanity that Kubrick gave us, where the apes are just wandering around. They're doing their ape thing, and there are these wild boars right there, and they're doing their wild boar thing. Nothing, state of nature, right? Until one ape picks up a bone that's been lying there, and he's like looking at it, and then he starts doing that. Is that nature? Have we now left nature? What about when he clubs to death the wild boar and eats it? Is that nature? Because he's using technology. What about when he clubs to death the other apes? Is that nature? So the point is simply that it's really difficult to define nature. It's much easier to assume what nature is, which is not the state, right? Okay, well, what's the state? What is government? What is the political realm? I don't think I need to say anymore, because we're at a unique position in history where we're asking that question. What does it mean to be in a state? And yeah, Putin belongs here, right? Because he's the state leader. What does that mean in Russia? What does it mean here? What is freedom? Eric Fromm's done some great work on this. What is freedom? Is it freedom for me to drive on the left side because I feel like I'm having an English kind of day? I should be free to do that, shouldn't I? No, that freedom has been curtailed, but I didn't curtail it. So then, am I free? Security. This is, of course, one of the big ones that we learned, especially after 9/11. What do we give up in order to feel safe? And are we really safe? And of course, all these questions are really questions of gods and monsters, aren't they? They're questions of what is more powerful than us that deserves worship, or at least acquiescence. What is more powerful than us that is fearful and deserves our horror and for us to recoil from? And if you remember, gods and monsters come from the same place. They come from here, and they come from here. We create them. We've created them as long as humans have been on this planet. The gods represent our greatest hopes. The monsters represent our greatest fears, and those hopes and fears live side by side, sometimes inside one another. All right, God's monsters in politics, go. Yeah, Charlie.
Hobbes model is sort of a God here spot.
Not benevolent.
Not even benevolent.
Nope.
So then how is that far from rebellion? Earlier, except for there's no bloodline.
Excellent question, Charlie, and not a pun in sight.
Sorry, I was late in class.
Charlie is our punner in resident. What a great question. The question was, what about Machiavelli? It's about 100 years earlier. The difference between Machiavelli is that he doesn't have a set of policies. He doesn't have a set of theories. He has what the prince should do. He's talking about a book called The Prince by Machiavelli. There's some suggestion that it's a satire, that it was meant for the de Medicis, which he knew were going to take over. And so he created this satire. Anyway, I don't know about that. I do know that The Prince is much more like a handbook that just says, hey, do this, don't do that, and this will happen. There's no theory behind it. So that's the difference. Did Hobbes kind of codify The Prince? Some people say that. They say he took the principles of The Prince that were unstated and stated them.